Today's lesson is on the properties of numbers. There's a lot of different properties that you'll need to know, but throughout the lesson I will try to give you lots of different hints that will help you memorize them. The first property is the commutative property, and we have both the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. The commutative property of addition simply states that if you add a plus b, it's the same if you switch it and do b plus a. So in other words, here's an example. 2 plus 3 is 5, which is the same as if you do 3 plus 2. Now, same thing with commutative property of multiplication. You can multiply in any order. So a times b is the same as if you were to switch it, b times a. So, for an example, 4 times 5 is 20, which is the same as 5 times 4. So, you can move the numbers around, and you'll still get the same answer. So, to remember this, I think of, commutative property has the word kind of commute in it. And commute simply means that you are moving from one place to another. So maybe you're in a car commuting, so you're moving, your numbers can move around, and you can still get the same solution. Commutative property. The next property is the associative property, and once again we have the associative property of addition and then the associative property of multiplication. The associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication shows that it does not matter the order in which you add or multiply. So in this case, you can first add a plus b and then add c, and it should be the same as if you were to add b plus c first and then add a. So, for example, let's say you have 1 plus 2 plus 3. You should get the same thing if you first do 2 plus 3 and then add 1. So let's check. This should give you 3, and 3 plus 3 is 6. And then over here, 2 plus 3 is 5, and 5 plus 1 is 6. So we get the same on both sides. The same idea applies for multiplication. So let's say we have 3 times 4 times 5. We should get the same thing if we do 4 times 5 first and then multiply by 3. So 3 times 4 is 12, and 12 times 5 is 60. And then over here we have 4 times 5 is 20, and 20 times 3 is 60, so we get the same on both sides. Now when you look at this, I want you to recognize, different from the commutative property, we have A, B, and C stay in the same order. A, B, and C. They don't move around. A, B, C, A, B, C. So our variables don't move around, but our parentheses will show which ones we associate with. So if you look up here at my little picture, who do you associate with? Maybe you first associate, maybe let's say Patrick and Squidward will associate with each other, and then SpongeBob is left out. Or you could think of it as they don't change order, but now Squidward and SpongeBob will associate with each other, and Patrick is left out. But notice how their order doesn't change. It's just who you associate with does change, and that is signified by parentheses. Now we have the identity property, and what I want you to think about with the identity property is nobody can change your identity. You are unique, you are who you are, and there's nobody that can change who you are. So I want you to think about, in addition, what can you do using addition that won't change the identity? And then what can you do using multiplication that will not change the identity? So as you can see with the identity property of addition, adding 0 does not change the identity. It would stay the same. So just like 3, if you add 0, it doesn't change anything. It just equals 3. And then the identity property of multiplication, multiplying by the number 1 does not change the identity. So if you have 6 times 1, it does not change the identity. It stays at 6. So the identity property. Nobody can change who you are. The fourth property on the list is the inverse property. So when I see the word inverse, I think of an inverted trick of snowboarding. Do you know what that means? A lot of people snowboard with their left foot forward. However, you can do a trick, so you go off a jump, you do some sort of trick, and you land with your opposite foot forward. So opposite, inverted, inverse. So we want to think about opposite of addition and opposite of multiplication. So in the inverse property of addition, you want to think about the opposite of addition. So opposite of a positive number would be a negative. So when you take a number and you add its opposite, you get 0. So for an example, 9 plus its opposite, its inverse, negative 9, equals 0. And now for the inverse property of multiplication, think about the opposite of multiplication is division. Or you could also think of reciprocal this fraction. So if you multiply a times 1 over a, it equals 1. So for example, if you have 8 times 1/8, it's the same as 8 divided by 8, which is 1. So an important part of information is, I'm sure you've heard the word reciprocal before. The fancy way of saying that is the multiplicative inverse. So quick review of reciprocal. Let's say you have 3/4. The reciprocal is 4/3. Or the reciprocal of 2 is 1 over 2. Reciprocal is the same thing as the multiplicative inverse. Here I have the symmetric property and the distributive property. Symmetric property just means that if A equals B, then B equals A. So in other words, if 4x is equal to 2y, it's the same thing as if you flip it, 2y equals 4x. Seems pretty self-explanatory, but it is called the symmetric property. And then the distributive property we will expand on more in a later lesson. But if you have a number out in front like this, you're multiplying that by both that are inside parentheses. So this would be equal to a times b plus a times c. For example, if you have 2 times the parentheses x plus 4, it equals 2 times x plus 2 times 4 is 8. Okay, final two properties, and they're very, very easy. Multiplication property of 0 just means what happens when you multiply by 0. And the multiplication property of -1, I want you to think about what happens when you multiply by -1. So the multiplication property of 0 just means that when you multiply by 0, it always equals 0. So if you have 12 times 0, it is always equal to 0. And then the multiplication property of -1, you multiply by -1, just means you keep the number but make it negative. So 7 times -1 equals -7. And that's it. Well, that was just easy peasy lemon squeezy. Good luck with the rest of the lesson, and don't forget my hints to help you memorize the different properties.